In the final decades of the Republic, the Trade Federation was the most powerful corporation in the galaxy, a private empire that controlled much of the Outer Rim. It had vast private armies, a fleet of deadly battleships, sovereign rule over numerous planets, and exclusive trade agreements with countless more, and it even had Senate representation. This powerful corporation played a major role in the fall of the Republic, as you surely know, and today we're going to examine it in detail, providing an overview of the corporation structure, what it did to turn a profit, and how it rose to power.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Unlike others among the galaxy's most infamous corporations, the Trade Federation was a fairly new organization. It was founded during the later stages of the Great Peace of the Republic in 350 BBY, a time when the Republic's centuries-long golden age was beginning to fade. In this period, the Republic was increasingly beset by dysfunction and internal crises, particularly in the Outer Rim, and these problems were worsened by squabbling between the megacorporations that controlled shipping in the Outer Rim at the time. Companies like Quasar Cargo, Red Star Shipping Lanes, Pulsar Supertanker, and Aurora Transportation were hindering trade by refusing to share navigational data and blacklisting their competitors from spaceports across the Outer Rim, causing inefficiencies and preventing numerous remote systems from getting the trade they needed to stay afloat. The Trade Federation was originally brought into being to solve these problems. Originally a Republic-chartered organization founded by a fairly diverse group of colonies-based trade interests, the Trade Federation's task was to mediate between the shipping cartels and to resolve disputes and curb the corporate abuses that were worsening the situation in the Outer Rim. Initially, it did its job quite well. It not only put a stop to the squabbling between the shipping cartels, but it also negotiated to improve shipping rates and make the policies of the various trading firms more efficient. As it grew increasingly successful, however, it evolved far beyond the task it had originally been chartered for, becoming a powerful shipping cartel in its own rights. It bought out several of the corporations it had been tasked with regulating, among them Pulsar Supertanker, and it offered numerous smaller companies membership in the organization, taking cuts of their profits in exchange for access to the Federation's increasingly vast resource pool. By 250 BBY, a century after the corporation was founded, the Trade Federation had more or less abandoned its original mission, morphing into a lobbying group that pushed the Senate to pass policy that favored the interests of the galaxy's shipping firms. All the while, it continued to expand its own shipping operations. The Federation built a merchant fleet of its own and began improving the Outer Rim's shipping infrastructure, establishing the Trade Explorer Corps to blaze new hyperspace routes and building spaceports, way stations, brokerage houses, depots, and retail outlets on thousands of planets across the galaxy. As the scourge of piracy became an increasingly major problem in the Outer Rim, one that most Outer Rim planetary security forces were too weak or corrupt to properly deal with, the Trade Federation also established the Trade Defense Force, a private navy that defended Trade Federation shipping convoys. By 200 BBY, the Trade Federation had become one of the most powerful shipping cartels in the galaxy, but its power was initially seen as a good thing by the Republic. It did a good job representing its members' interests, it greatly improved infrastructure and the flow of commerce in the Outer Rim, put an end to the disputes that had been hindering trade in the region previously, and its disciplined, well-funded, and highly effective private military helped the judicials and PSFs battle pirates in some of the galaxy's most troubled sectors. Indeed, the champions of privatization and deregulation cited the Trade Federation as an example of an ideal Republic institution, a force for good in the galaxy. Whether that was truly the case is questionable, but all but the Trade Federation's staunchest partisans would acknowledge that, at the very least, it didn't stay that way. The Trade Federation ultimately became what it had been created to regulate, a powerful, monopolistic shipping cartel that crushed its competitors and valued profit above all else. Now that we've covered where the Trade Federation came from, it's time to talk about its structure. By 200 BBY, the Trade Federation had become a vast conglomerate with branches all over the galaxy, particularly in the Outer Rim. It had bought up or allied with all manner of smaller corporations over the years, and some of these continued to function semi-independently under Trade Federation purview, among them Ket Shipping, Transtech Droidworks, Pulsar Supertanker, Dovala Mining, Horschkessel Drive Inc., Cotillery Transports Limited, the Ma'ar Shaddam Weaponsmith Guild, Resec Hull Space, and Bactoid Armor Workshop. Other companies that the Trade Federation acquired were directly incorporated into the cartel or liquidated. Either way, the Trade Federation had influence over numerous aspects of the galactic economy, from mining to the manufacturing of weapons, droids, and starships. Its focus, however, remained on shipping, and the Trade Federation made most of its annual profits through its control of trade across the galaxy. The Trade Federation had installations on thousands of worlds, from spaceports and warehouses to way stations and military bases. Many of these worlds signed exclusive trade agreements with the Federation, giving the corporation complete control of trade to and from hundreds of star systems, and it had major shares in trade virtually everywhere else. Apart from its military, its most important asset was the enormous Trade Federation merchant fleet, an enormous armada of bulk freighters built by Horschkessel and owned by the Trade Federation, the most famous ships of which were the 3-kilometer-long Lucrehulk class LH-3210 cargo freighters. Most of the internal hierarchy and structure of the Trade Federation is unknown. What is known, however, is that all various branches, subsidiaries, and component bureaucracies of the Trade Federation entered to the Trade Federation Directorate, the corporation's ruling council. The Directorate consisted of 7 members, one of which held the position of Viceroy. The Viceroy of the Trade Federation was the overall leader of the organization and the chairman of the Directorate. The Viceroy was the most powerful individual in the Trade Federation, but the Directorate as a whole still held most of the governing power within the corporation, and the Viceroy only operated as its representative. In the prequel era, the Trade Federation was pretty much synonymous with the Neimoidians, who controlled virtually the entire corporation during the Republic's final decade. But for most of its history, the Trade Federation was actually pretty diverse. From the beginning, there were many Neimoidians in the Trade Federation, and Neimoidian shipping firms had been among the corporation's founding members, but many of the Federation's other founding interests were dominated by members of other species, albeit mostly ones with strong presences in the colony's region. As a result, until the final decades of Republic history, the Trade Federation's leaders and personnel were a mix of humans, Duros, Neimoidians, Grands, Celestians, Volpterines, and members of a few other species, with humans being the majority for most of the group's history. Before the events of the Ariadu Summit in 33 BBY, the Trade Federation Directorate consisted of 1 Neimoidian plus 1 Gran, 1 Celestin, and 4 humans, 2 from Kuat and the others from Filve and Balmora. Nonetheless, the Neimoidians played a major role in the Trade Federation throughout its history. Neimoidians within the organization made up the Neimoidian faction, which had its own unofficial leaders and slowly took over the Trade Federation during the Republic's final century. The Trade Federation's Neimoidian faction actually played a major role in the Neimoidian government. The Inner Circle, which ruled Neimoidian space from Neimoidia, was led by the highest-ranking Neimoidian in the Trade Federation, meaning that a Neimoidian that became Viceroy was both the chairman of the Trade Federation and of the Neimoidian Inner Circle, their power kept in check only by the rest of the Trade Federation Directorate and by Neimoidia's Trade Monarch. During Newt Gunray's time as Viceroy, this led to the slow consolidation of Trade Federation and Neimoidian interests, bringing all of Neimoidian space under Trade Federation control and, in turn, cementing Neimoidian control over the Trade Federation, as we'll discuss in greater depth later. The Viceroy of the Trade Federation was also the senior commander of the Trade Defense Force, the Trade Federation's private military. The TDF was one of the most well-known and important elements of the Trade Federation, but it changed dramatically over the course of its history. The TDF, as it was at its founding in 274 BBY, was a much different beast from the TDF of the prequel era. It was initially a small, space-based force, the Trade Federation's last resort against the pirates attacking their shipping convoys. Before founding the TDF, the Trade Federation had previously tried using the dues paid by member companies to provide funding for the cash-strapped PSFs of the sectors in which it operated. But this didn't accomplish much, and so the Directorate decided to establish its own security force that it would fund and operate on its own.